My thematics for the presentation is the Afghan war in Denmark, because we face a paradox in Denmark. Among the warfaring coalition countries in Afghanistan, Denmark is the one with the highest losses relatively in relation to the size of the population. As you know, by now 31 Danish soldiers from our small country have lost their lives in Afghanistan. And the other side of the paradox is that on the other side, there is more support for the war in Denmark than in most other coalition countries, including the United States. A recent opinion poll showed that every second Dane supports the continued participation of Denmark in the war, of the Danish forces in the war, while every third of our countrymen and women are against it. One reason for that may be the constant and high-profile Danish government support for the war since 2001. Until 2009, it was embodied emphatically by our Prime Minister, Mr. Rasmussen, who then became the Secretary General of NATO. The government's stated objectives for Denmark's participation in the war have been, on the one hand, the perceived necessity of the fight against terrorism, which, if not stopped in Afghanistan, is supposed to endanger our domestic way of life in Denmark, combined with a strong emphasis on Danish alignment with the NATO and US policies. On the other hand, the rationale has been the materialization, the wish to contribute to materialize in Afghanistan universal and Danish values in terms of democracy, human rights, and gender equality. To this end, military force has been combined with substantial civilian development cooperation with Afghanistan, focused not least on primary education. The outcomes, however, of last year, 2009's presidential elections in Afghanistan and the whole process exposed the corrupt nature of the Kabul regime, and it's not in line with the principles of the rule of law and jeopardizes the impact of the cooperation through its government offices. Subsequently, the Danish decision-makers tacitly have down-tuned the materialization of the democratic values, etc., emphasizing instead that the war must continue until the job is done. That is, a decisive military victory over Taliban or Al-Qaeda has been accomplished. In our public debate in Denmark, we have mainly overlooked the fact that, casualties notwithstanding, the Danish contribution to the US NATO-led war is less than 1% of the entire warfare, thus of marginal importance in spite of the high costs also in financial terms, which is another issue not debated very much, but very pertinently mentioned by the earlier speakers here. Danish media have also not focused very much on the enemy, about whom little is known. There is no public information about their casualties, including the civilian losses in Afghanistan. In reverse, the prevailing Danish foreign policy tradition since the Second World War until the 1990s for support to the UN and for prioritizing it to be an active, honest broker in negotiated international conflict resolution. This tradition that we saw employed, for example, during the European Conference for Security Cooperation in the 1970s and 80s, by now seems to have been a bit or maybe more or less forgotten. By the way, Danish media have also not focused too much on what exactly are the specific relations between the war in Afghanistan and international terrorism. Most of this terrorism that has scared us, and it was so powerfully described by Mr. Jahanpur about 9/11, it appears to be carried out very much by homegrown radicals in the West, including Denmark, and in some Muslim countries which are not directly affected by the war. It appears a safe assumption that such terrorists from Saudi Arabia, from Denmark, from Hamburg, wherever, are rather motivated than prevented for their actions by the war in Afghanistan. This war, as we have heard described for more than 30 years, is most of all a tragedy for the Afghan people. In addition, the repercussions of the warfare entail a risk for regional destabilization, as already mentioned, most of all in the first place to Pakistan. But it is also sad if a nation lures itself into warfare on false assumptions. The relative poverty of our public and political debate on the Afghanistan war issue indicates that the Danish government may somehow have been forgetting the importance of congruence between the political and the military objectives when waging a war. The political objectives, as mentioned, were initially defined as the fight against terrorism and for democracy, human rights and gender equality. When the democracy, the human rights and the gender equality is lost on the way, en route, what have we left? We have the fight against terrorism in order to make the world a more secure place. But what if terrorism is rather strengthened than weakened by the war? And what if regional stability is rather weakened than strengthened by the war? Then the military intervention is working against the political objectives because the assumptions were wrong. In consequence, the Danish Council for International Conflict Resolution, our little think tank NGO, newly baptized, finds that the possibilities should be further explored for how Denmark can make a difference through the use of political and diplomatic measures and development cooperation, rather than contributing to the escalation of a war which it will be very difficult and costly, if at all possible, to win. Such measures, I mean the political and the diplomatic ones, could consist in raising the voice in the relevant international forums about the need for a Central Asian Regional Security Conference, which might be one possible way out of the war, for which the gates are not wide open otherwise. The outcomes of such conference should be guaranteed by the great powers, the close ones, and the faraway ones, which should also participate in it. Because even the government in Kabul wants to negotiate with Taliban, and a recent opinion poll has once again confirmed that, not so surprisingly, the majority of the people in Afghanistan want a negotiated peaceful settlement of the conflict. So, why has it not been possible to start real talks, as far as we know, at least, with Taliban so far? Well, the missing result seems to indicate the necessity of this regional settlement involving all parties of the conflict. And one could be a bit surprised that Mr. Obama did not mention in early December or in his Nobel speech in Oslo a few days later this option, this avenue, the regional conference avenue. But he may need some encouragement from his allies in order to embark on it. Finally, in the wider perspective, what is happening in Afghanistan seems to indicate that the ambitious NATO project of being the worldwide defender of democracy and human rights by the use of military phobic and universal approach to international conflict resolution. And it seems to indicate that it would be beneficial for Danish foreign policy to step back from its recent tradition for prioritizing the, in every respect, very costly participation in the 3 US NATO-led peace enforcement operations, or wars if you like, in Kosovo, in Iraq and in Afghanistan, and return for Denmark to return to the prioritization and negotiated international conflict resolution, possibly supported by the UN and regional peace enforcement, for which the blue helmets, you know, Denmark used to be a major contributor. Thank you very much for your long-lasting patience.